Hi, welcome to the GDC Summer 2020 session, Accessibility Best Practices in Game Communication. I'm Karen Stevens, and I'm EA Sports Accessibility Lead. Now, before I go into detail, general disclaimer. This is purely a best practices presentation based on observations and experiences, and is no way a promise as to how past, present, or future games may or may not be made. Also, if you have any questions that are legal related, please talk to your local legal counsel. I'm not a lawyer and I'm not authorized to make any sort of recommendations along those lines. So, disclaimer out of the way. What is accessibility? I consider accessibility the correction of a mismatch between a person and their environment. This is more than just disability. This includes things like if a tall person can't fit in an airplane seat, well, they have an accessibility problem. Or if a deaf person needs captions in order to follow something, that's also an accessibility problem. I happen to be deaf, so that one's pretty near and dear to my heart. In general, if settings are not accessible, then they may as well not exist. So for games such as Madden, we have added in the concept of a welcome screen. This means that as soon as you get into the game, as soon as the game boots, before it's even fully installed, there's a setting screen that lets you turn on all of the really important settings for people with disabilities. This can include volume control. This can include the in-game communication things we'll be talking about today. And this allows people to turn on the settings they need before the game even begins. And I can tell you from a captioning perspective how important that is, because I have sat through many intros of games and not have been able to turn on captioning until well later in the game, and by then I'm lost. This is true of all settings. It's really, really important that they're there from the very beginning. And if you're wondering, well, why even have an accessibility menu? Well, it's true that technically all user settings are accessibility settings. However, especially when it comes to early install, not all of those settings will always be available. So for the case of Madden, every setting we considered super important for that type of scenario, we had gathered up into the accessibility settings screen. Now, some of those settings are actually in other screens as well, such as volume control. But this means we can guarantee that those settings are available in a wide variety of places at any given point in time without having to worry about any other technical complication. So it greatly simplified the problem for Meta in particular. FIFA, this is a screen from FIFA, also has an accessibility screen. Now, we're going to talk a little bit briefly today about the importance of legibility of font and other things for in-game communication. I will say that I gave a GDC talk several years ago about Madden accessibility that covers this in great detail. And I strongly recommend going back through and watching those presentations because it even concludes how to use this and source code in the actual presentation file. So I recommend looking at those for more information because we really don't have time to cover it here, but it is a really important topic. For Madden and many other EA titles, we believe in putting the accessibility menu in as many places as possible. For here, for example, is a way to get to it from a pause menu. It's important to be able to, for any setting, including those for in-game communication, being able to get into those settings. And as you see here, we actually have icons, and those icons are to help those who have trouble reading but can follow icons much easier to be able to easily find those settings. So I've already mentioned in-game communication quite a few times. Also, it's in the presentation title, so you're probably wondering what I mean by that. The goal here is to allow players to communicate with one another in an accessible way. This can include voice chat, text chat, canned chat, contextual chat, emotes, and more. Navigation is also important because, again, if you can't get to these settings and use them, they're not very helpful. So menu narration is one way of handling navigation for people who have different types of vision issues. But before I get into any more details, since this will come up and it's always a good time to discuss it, legible font. Legible font is one of the biggest issues we have for accessibility in the game industry at this time. I recommend a minimum of 28 pixel tall, 3 pixel wide font on a 1080p screen, and that comes from a variety of user research. That may seem rather big, but if you're talking about the television industry, their minimum font size recommendations on things like captioning is actually 80 pixels tall in this scenario. So 28 pixels really isn't very big. And we recommend a 4.5:1 contrast ratio or better. I actually have a slide at the very end that links to a tool to find this out. But basically this means you have to have enough contrast between your text and your background so it stands out enough so people have the best chance of being able to see it. So keep that in mind. Also recommend for all types of venues, including those relating to game communication, use sans serif fonts, so things without a lot of flourishes. Examples could be Arial, Helvetica, Verdana, and Comic Sans. This presentation is actually in Verdana, and I can guarantee you that everything on this presentation is 4.5:1 contrast or better. I highly recommend using these types of fonts. Comic Sans tends to get a bad reputation, but really, it's a very, very good font, particularly for dyslexia. Those with dyslexia have trouble distinguishing different characters, and the way Comic Sans is made makes it very easy for them to use, more so than most actual fonts made for dyslexia. So I highly recommend that. Keep in mind that font is so important in so many places that, like the defense industry, a lot of places insist on using that font for all business documents simply because it's easy to read. So keep that in mind. It is okay to have alternate fonts. So if you have a fancy font that fits your game style, it's okay to do that, but it's highly recommended to have an option to turn that off, which I've seen more and more games, and that's really a great thing. If nobody can read your text, then again, it's sort of like it may as well not exist. So none of us are sitting down and saying, let's make games people can't play, or let's make menus people can't use. So it's important to keep these things in mind. Resize is recommended. However, that's not a pass to say you should have super tiny font to begin with. I do recommend having larger fonts like these minimum sizes. It's okay to make your resize go smaller, but just keep in mind that that shouldn't necessarily be the default. When it comes to subtitling, you do want to make sure you don't cover the entire screen, but at the same point in time, for most text, there really is no maximum size. So if you make an OK button that fills the entire screen, technically speaking, that's perfectly fine. So you're probably wondering when I'm going to get to the topic of menu narration. Menu narration means providing an audible way of navigating menus and game experiences. The primary audiences are for people who are blind, low vision, have cognitive issues, sensory processing issues, or just those who just in general have issues reading. Maybe they don't know English or whatever language your game is in. These help all those groups. One thing to keep in mind is that wording matters. Now, when you're doing menu narration, you have to describe everything that's on the screen in some useful way. It's particularly areas that involve navigation. This includes things like specifying what the control names are, what they do, what their current setting is, and that's actually current setting is actually really important. Let's say you're going up to a light switch in a room and that light switch controls a light in a different room. If you're turning it on and off, if you walk up to a switch and it's just a button and it says toggle light switch, is the light on? Is the light off? Are you turning the light on? There's no way to know. The same problems exist in games. It's important to say what the current setting is. But it's also okay, let's say if you have something like a slider, to shorten it while you're using the thing. So let's say you say at the beginning, you have a slider and the current value set is 50. That's fine. Let's say you're sliding the slider. You don't have to say that every time. You can say 51, 52. That's perfectly acceptable. So keep that in mind. It is also important to narrate items that require user action that are not navigatable. It is recommended to make everything navigatable, but if that doesn't fit your needs, then it's okay to narrate things when the screen first loads. But that's still important to do. If you need more examples or would like more examples beyond what this presentation covers today, I highly recommend turning on Windows Narrator. If you type in the Start menu Narrator, you can find out how to turn it on very easily. And it will narrate your PC the way a blind person would be navigating it. And I will say that our design teams for everything I show you today did that. If you have an Apple, then you can use VoiceOver. It does the equivalent. And in fact, even mobile apps have the ability to do screen reading. So I recommend turning it on your platform of choice and using that to determine more examples of how things should sound. because there are many different options, and more information you have, the better choices you'll make. So that said, let's listen to what pre-recorded menu narration sounds like in a game.
Welcome to NHL 20. For accessibility settings, press Y, your NHL experience. I am new to sports gaming. This offers simpler controls and gameplay. Settings and accessibility. Press LB/RB to navigate accessibility categories. Visual accessibility, color blindness, default, protanopia, red weak. Audio accessibility, master volume, 9. One option to quickly turn off all audio on or off. 10. Your NHL experience. I am new to sports gaming. This offers controls, NHL 94. 2-button controls, only basic actions available. Difficulty, rookie, you are new to the game. Gameplay presets. Preset 2, traditional, 4-minute periods. NHL 20 settings. Thank you for setting up your hospitality settings. You can make changes to these at a later time by visiting the settings screen. Go back and continue.
So in case you were wondering, this is actually the initial experience for NHL, which is why it's called the hospitality screen. The hospitality screen and the welcome screen are essentially the same thing. Now, potential benefits of pre-recording your menu narration. It's relatively straightforward to add to the game. You can add it roughly the way you would add any other sound effect to an option. It does sound exactly as intended because it's literally a recorded voice. The biggest drawback is that it needs updating when the menus change. If you don't keep them up to date, then your narration may not match what is actually going on, or you may have gaps and missing audio. So it can be a lot of overhead to have to keep on re-recording things as they get updated over time. It also, if your game has a lot of menus and you want to narrate them, it may require a lot of audio files. And I will say, if you're wondering what to narrate, it makes a lot of sense to be able to narrate to get into the game and also to be able to get to all the settings, because those settings do matter for being able to use your game and also be able to modify the way you communicate with other players. So keep that in mind, that those are both very important. Now, the flip side to pre-recorded menu narration is generated. So let's listen to what that sounds like.
Enlarge on-field graphics Enlarge on-field graphics option is set to off. Enlarge on-field graphics option is set to on. Bright, VoIP, pass. Audio mix option is set to custom. Audio mix option is set to broadcast. In-game commentary set to 100. Set to 99. Set to 98. Depth 1. Namer Wilson. Position QG. Morale modified. Morale 50. Speed rating 86. Acceleration rating 9. Agility ratings are Wilson 90. AHB, you have 4 options. C Carson 87 overall is selected. R Penny 78 overall.
Now, the most obvious thing I'm sure you've noticed is it may sound robotic because it is literally a robotic voice. On the plus side, this actually lends itself to audio speed adjustments. If hypothetically you ever wanted to speed up the audio, it's actually designed to be sped up. If a blind user is using a PC, for example, they typically have the audio set to many times what standard speech is. So it's like a super fast Micro Machines commercial. That's just how blind users are used to using their PCs. So the ability to have that option to put that in your game is really powerful. It may not sound that odd to those who are expecting it. This tool that we use in Madden is called Flight, and I will have links to it later. Of course, you're welcome to use it in your own games. It's a third-party type tool. And this tool is used in many different games. So because of that, when they heard it, the gamers heard it, they're like, oh, you used Flight, didn't you? And they totally expected it. They accepted what it sounded like. It wasn't a problem at all. So yes, it does sound robotic, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. So pluses in general. No audio files are required. This means that We can change the menus as many times as we want, and it will always be exactly up to date. There are no additional recordings of audio required. Deep UI integration can result in great coverage. In Madden 20, we literally did this at the low of a level as possible. So we narrated a button, we narrated a slider, we narrated a table, and you saw some of those things in the video. And this meant that it wasn't just that one slider we did, which is what it would be if we did pre-recorded. It was literally every slider in the entire game. Same thing with button. Literally every button in the entire game. This meant that we have an enormous amount of coverage for this in Madden with really not a lot of additional work. The original work was put in to be able to get to all the settings for especially accessibility, but in general, all the settings, be able to get into the game. And then we saw we were at there. And the answer was very, very far. But then it seemed weird that things like the depth chart you saw earlier, or also the one where you're listing what the quarterbacks were, that's a table, and that's not in that critical path. But the team is like, we've gotten this far, we have to do this too. So that's why so much of Madden is done, but most of it was not like done as we must make sure this entire screen is done. It was done at the widget level, and just huge amounts of the game turned on all at the same time. Now, the drawbacks is that it is more technically challenging to integrate it this way. For example, you have to actually take that text, send it to a module. That module translates it into audio, it sends it back, and then you have to play that audio, which is simpler than just pushing a button and playing audio. I'm sorry, it's more complicated than pushing a button and playing audio. So that's important to keep in mind. There is processing power required for doing this. In fact, to the point where if you're wondering why Madden does not have narration, like Madden 20 does not have menu narration while the ball is physically in play, it's because there is just not quite enough processing power to be able to handle that at that time. So there are technical challenges. It is possible to use cloud services, and in that case, you would actually take the text, send it to the cloud translates it, and it sends it back. That does reduce the amount of processing power required. However, it does require transactions, and there's latency and you don't necessarily have a lot of control of how long that takes. So it's possible that by the time the audio comes back, it's not very timely. If you do use a locally generated tool, it will generally be more timely than a cloud. Also, clouds have transaction fees. Not all, but most I've seen do. So it's important to keep in mind that every time something is translated, it may have a cost. There may be a subscription fee or some other types of monetization that you have to take account of. So that's also important to know. Language support may be limited, and it varies on tool. Some tools do more than others. English is the most popular, but just keep that in mind that what tool you pick may limit what languages you can follow. So moving on from menu narration, text trap is literally being able to enter text like using a keyboard style interface or literal keyboard and being able to enter it into the screen. Now, the funny thing is I actually had a really hard time getting a picture of a keyboard and text at the same time because most games use system level keyboards. And there are benefits in doing that, but it also means for using a system level keyboard, it doesn't screen capture very well. So covering what text chat is. Avoid holding down multiple buttons. This is actually true of games in general because you don't know how much dexterity a person has. And when you require them to hold something at an angle, they may not be able to accurately do that. So it's pushing one button at a time or one direction at a time and confirming works much better than just attempting to say, yeah, hold this over at an angle, then hit A, then angle it again. That gets harder. Stay in the game. It's important to not require somebody, because this is used in a multiplayer scenario, to pause the game, leave the game, to enter, not necessarily leave, but pause the actual gameplay and enter text that way. It should happen while they can still tell what's going on. Potential window options to make this more friendly may include position, size, transparency, and we will look at that in a minute. Chat history and scrolling is also important, especially if you have lots of people talking at the same time. You should have some amount of history, maybe 100 lines or so, that people can scroll back to. Keyboard narration matters. If you're using system-level keyboards, which is one of the reasons why they're popular, they come with menu narration. You don't have to add anything. It's already directly supported and generally works really well. So keep that in mind. If you do not use a system keyboard, it is important to narrate it yourself. And also keep in mind that, yes, blind people or people who are unable to read may still be using a keyboard. That is still a scenario. You don't necessarily know why people are using a feature. For example, I know that text chat is very popular among women because there is a lot of toxicity in the gaming space still, and it avoids harassment if they do not voice themselves. So that makes synthesized really, really popular. And speaking about it, there's a lot of overlap between text chat and voice chat. Because when you're doing accessible communication and you're doing text chat, it's important that you narrate the text chat too. And we'll talk about how those two overlap. Here's an example of voice chat. Now, important things are the icons that show who's talking. If somebody is deaf, they may not even realize chat is happening. So it's important to show that this is the person talking and have some sort of thing. Here you see a little headset next to my icon. I'm F. And that lets people know that I'm talking. And that lets people who cannot hear know they have to turn this menu on. Now, for games such as Madden, voice chat and text chat output to the same screen, meaning that when you type things in with text in your chat window, it shows up on the screen that shows the text history, and you can scroll through and see everybody who's talking. If I was to talk and somebody had transcription turned on, so they had speech to text turned on instead of text to speech, it would show all of my text in the exact same window. It's highly recommended to actually combine those all to the same window. So there's only one place someone has to look to see in-game communication. And from their perspective, the perspective of somebody who's deaf, it is the same information. It really doesn't matter where it came from, if it was spoken or typed. It's the same information. Now, vice versa is also important. So not just the ability to capture text, but you have to be able to narrate this text too. Transcribed audio may use text chat for display purposes, but narrating that is also important as an option. And you can use cloud software and things to make this happen. So in both ways, and I'll cover that in a little bit as to what types of services are available for chat transcription. But it's not just the transcription, it's also the narration of it. And you can go back to using that tool, let's say it's English for flight that I said. There are other tools out there that support other languages. But I do highly recommend that it goes both ways, that they're options, and they should not be tied to one another. Anybody should be able to enter text, and anybody should be able to see anything that was entered, and everyone should be able to hear, if they want to, the text chat and the audible chat. Now, it is perfectly okay to not do all that at the same time and to make those separate settings. Just the important thing to remember is that both of those are important ways of consuming information, and both those are ways of producing information, speech and writing. So keep that in mind. So for an example of what voice chat with transcription sounds like, this video is actually muted so I can speak through it. And what you see here is a menu in this text window in Madden, which could be either text or voice input. You can't tell because that does not show the screen keyboard. And you can actually change the position and the transparency of this window anywhere you want. So when you go in game, you can decide if contrast is more important to you or seeing the game behind it is more important to you. So then it becomes a relatively seamless experience where somebody is able to have a chat, follow what's going on, and still be able to play with somebody else with minimal interruption. Now, another thing that's useful is can chat. This is an example from Anthem of what can chat may look like. In this case, it's a wheel. It is often the form of a list or a wheel. NHL uses a list. You often have pre-selected phrases, and the nice thing about that is that you don't have to type those in. It's still important if you have can chat to also support text chat, because not everything is covered by canned chat. Phrases can be context-based. So for example, in football, it's okay if offense and defense have different canned phrases available, for example. As always, avoid holding down multiple buttons, including sticks and D-pads, because you don't know what people can do. So here's an example of canned chat in progress. I will say the first half of this video is the ability to see how it looks when somebody else is using it. Then the second half of the video is the examples of it being used.
Helmet here. Level 1. Cancel that. I think this place could use some looting. Making contact with enemy. Proudus, let's move this way. I hope you're with me.
I'm gonna raid this area here.
Too slow. Gotta hop up here. Never mind. Gotta hop up here.
Got my eyes on this sector. Let's go over here. Go company.
Now, the interesting thing about Apex, it actually has a ping system, so it's contextualized. So you may have noticed there that the cursor is over various objects on the screen, and I could say, talk about this more or less, and it would give information specific to that. So an example I gave before of maybe it's the offense or defense halves of a sports game, it could be, I'm pointing to this object, tell me about it. Another important thing is the ability to customize this chat. So here in Apex, I should say, it is a list of options you can pick from and a list of what you want to see, and it allows you to add some flavor as to what types of things you want to say quickly. And that really helps. It'd be even more beneficial if there is a way to actually enter your own text. But considering it's using NPC type voices to voice these things, that's perfectly fine. But it's just a way for people to customize how they want to communicate with others. One last thing to talk about is emotes. Emotes are basically a way of having a gesture to be able to explain what someone is thinking. So it may be a wave, it may be come over here. Those can all be in the same type of window as we saw before for canned chat. It's also important to narrate all of those as well, because if you don't narrate the different options, people aren't going to know they're there and how to use them. And the whole point here is to make communication as accessible as possible. So for an example of what an emote looks like, here is a clip from Anthem.
The radio signals.
So as you see, it's a quick little emote, but it's really helpful just to give another way for people to communicate. Now, before we wrap this up, I am going to push this point again, legible font. None of these menu options matter if people can't see them. It is really, really important to have legible font throughout your entire game. Ideally on a 1080p screen, at least 28 pixels tall, 3 pixels wide. It's okay if it's larger. The 4.5:1 contrast ratio is also super important, along with having simplified fonts and resize when available. So just saying that again, if you catch no other point, remember that. So I'm sure you're interested in what tools we're using. For the menu narration that is roboticized, it is Flight, which is the cmuflight.org. I recommend pausing this video or going to the slides themselves in order to get this information. Most of EA's games is using IBM Watson for its text-to-speech, speech-to-text. And that means it's using it for the taking and transcribing people's voices into text. And also it's using it for taking that text and then making it audible for specifically in-game communication and having an actual voice conversation. So it uses Watson both ways. I will know that there are other tools out there. I know Xbox One has some good things built in, as does Windows 10. So keep in mind there are other tools out there. Do a little investigation. This is just simply what we're using at EA. For additional tools, I do recommend contrast-ratio.com. Just use a little eyedropper and paint and find out where your values are. And this tool takes RGB and it takes hex. And it lets you determine if you're at least 4.5 to 1. If you're not, I strongly recommend increasing your contrast until you reach it. I do have, like I said, other presentations that cover these things, so please look in the GDC Vault. For more information on EA's titles, ea.com/able has lots of information there. If you're looking to contact me, EA_accessible on Twitter is the best way. If you want to give feedback on games, I strongly recommend using the ea.com/able accessibility portal. We do have more information there for being able to submit bugs and things, and those get in the database, and they're extremely hard for us to lose. You can also email me at able@ea.com, but keep in mind that as I pass emails along, after a while, they kind of get lost in the shuffle. So I strongly recommend using the portal whenever possible. So thank you so much for coming to the presentation. I hope that you have lots of good information you pulled out of it. I do have an Ask Me Anything session scheduled for later in the week. So feel free to join me there if you wish to ask any questions. And thank you again for your time. Bye.